Set.
Welcome to the Change Your Thoughts, Change Your Life podcast. I'm your host, Nadia Dela Cruz, founder of the Wayne Dyer Wisdom Community. You can get more details about this podcast, upcoming events, and more at nadiadelacruz.com. Now, today I have a very special guest joining me. Dassi Ma was the primary caregiver and assistant to Ram Dass on Maui for the last 15 years of his life. You can read part of her story in a segment she wrote in the book, Whisper in the Heart, The Ongoing Presence of Neem Karoli Baba. And she continues to support Ram Dass's legacy as the president of Hanuman Maui, where his home and gardens are preserved as a spiritual sanctuary. Dassi, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have this opportunity for us to chat.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we got connected a few months ago. I was on a family trip to Hawaii with my husband and my kids, and truly unexpected series of events came together where I was able to come and visit Hanuman Maui. That was not part of the plan. I didn't know that was going to happen. There were so many synchronicities that came together. I actually talked about all of that in a previous episode called Landing at Ram Dass's Door, and that's episode 210 for anyone who wants to hear that. But that's where we met, and I loved what all of you are doing there and the love that you carry on in that space. And that's why I wanted to reach out and have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Nadia.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got started in spirituality? Were you always spiritual?
Not really. I was brought up a Catholic, and I had 16 years of Catholic education. And frankly, I credit Wayne as the individual who got me back on the spiritual path. So in the 70s, I sort of rebelled against my religion at the time. I was turned off to organized religion, as were many, many others during the 70s. Sure. And at that point, I even considered myself to be agnostic. And that lasted for, almost 10 years. And then in the 80s, in the corporate arena, several of my fellow managers would exchange motivational leadership cassette. I guess they were cassette tape albums, and they were really cool. There were 6 or 12 of them in an album, 6 cassettes, and when you got a good one, it was great. And somehow or other, Wayne Dyer, one of his albums, I believe it was How to Be a No Limit Person. Mm-hmm. I think it was that. I'm not sure, but it was one of them, and I just loved it, and I loved what he was saying, and I think at that point he was deepening into spirituality himself. And so, as I would get a new cassette album, it was like, wow, here's the next level, and this is where Wayne is now. It was really an exciting time. And, I loved his storytelling ability and his humor and the way he was able to simplify complex spiritual concepts so that everyone could readily understand them. And I love that he was open to all forms of religion. He was truly a spiritual seeker. Mm-hmm. So after I listened to the album, I sought out all of Wayne's works and looked forward to new releases as the years went by. So, without a doubt, Wayne was a major key to opening my door of spirituality. Me, as well as hundreds of thousands of others,
right?
Often here, and people who come here to Hanuman Maui, whether they're caregivers or personal retreatants or whatever, I many times hear them say, I was introduced to spirituality by Wayne Dyer. So anyway, in the late 80s, I plunged into a Zen practice. And Wayne's work at that point was a springboard to other spiritual teachers. And I started to attend a lot of spiritual workshops, including lectures by Wayne. And at that point, I even had a group that would come over to my house on a weekly basis, a group of friends, and we would discuss different spiritual concepts. Mm-hmm. So I come a long way from my agnostic period in the 70s. And
you sure have. What an interesting arc to your personal story, right? That you had this exploration where you covered the gamut, being raised religious, right? Probably traditional religious upbringing.
Very traditional.
To agnostic, to Wayne Dyer. And, he didn't start speaking about spirituality until the 80s, the late 80s. And I think his first book on spirituality, You'll See It When You Believe It, was published in the early 90s. But of course, he'd been starting to get into that a few years before, probably also because of his marriage to Marcy, because she was quite a spiritual woman as well.
Uh-huh. Wow.
But I had a similar experience as you in that I discovered Wayne Dyer, and my first book was his first spiritual book. And everyone that came after that, I was like, oh, it's like it was getting deeper. And as he was exploring this, I was exploring it. I discovered other teachers, which is also how I discovered Ram Dass. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And so Wayne talked about Ram Dass in his books, and particularly in his audio cassettes. And I didn't follow up until someone actually handed me a tape of Ram Dass, a cassette tape. It was in 1993, and I put it in my car cassette player on my way home, and I arrived at my destination, and I just sat there and listened to the entire tape, and I just felt like I am home. I am home. He spoke of, I think it was called Compassionate Heart. I'm not sure. Compassionate Heart, yes. And he spoke of love and compassion and God, and it just rang so true to me. Yeah, I really felt that I found my home. And he showed how to live in love, and constantly reminded me that, he was only the worm, that his teacher, Maharaji Neem Karoli Baba, was the fisherman, and we were the fish. So, even to the end, he said, I'm just the worm. He didn't want to be considered a guru. But, he really introduced me to the concept of heart space. And he did it not by lecturing, but just by being and loving, and in the end, dying exactly as he was. He was basically a fellow pilgrim, eager to share his missteps. And that's Wayne and him, maybe we can talk about this in a few minutes, but Wayne and him, their lecturing style was very similar. They used their missteps as springboards for great spiritual stories. And Ram Dass just radiated love, even later on from his wheelchair. And
definitely, yeah.
So at that point, I didn't know if he was living or dead. And next day I remember going back into work and trying to figure out, if he was still living and what he had done since, since the tape that I had was, it seemed like it was a homemade tape by someone, who was in the audience. So it was, and I didn't have access in 93 to the internet, as most people didn't. So, but I found out that he had written some books, and one of them being Be Here Now. I was just in the corporate world and missed it. But I found out he was going to do a lecture in in Washington, D.C. I was living in South Jersey, right next to Philly at the time. So it was, and he was doing it the next month. So I signed up for that, and a bunch of us rode down to Washington, D.C. And then shortly there, I thought seeing him in person, it was like, you know, he was really, he kept on morphing into Maharaji. But after that, I went to an Omega Institute retreat in Rhinebeck, the big spiritual retreat center, and I did a week with him that summer. And then from then on, all my vacation time and time off was dedicated to following Ram Dass wherever he went, you know, whether it was Costa Rica or Canada or, you know, all over the country for retreats and workshops and, you know, just an evening lecture sometimes. And at that point, I volunteered to do some seva for them. I did some photography and edited tapes for the tape library, for his foundation. And I do that after, you know, my day of work ended, which sometimes was 8, 9 o'clock at night. So I did this and followed him. And then 4 years later, in 1997, he had a major hemorrhaging stroke that was just a miracle that he lived. It was so bad. And with that stroke, he was partially paralyzed and had aphasia as well as other things. But he continued to teach. And I remember at one point, it was after his stroke, I had this really vivid dream. And in the dream, I was taking care of him. And I woke up, I was in a sweat. It was like, and there was nothing supernatural or, you know, extraordinary about a dream. It was just, I was giving him medicine and helping him wash, and it was so real. And so the next day I went into work and I inquired about, is there any possibility of an early retirement? My wish wasn't granted, but the seed was planted. So, and then he started, after he was recuperating from a stroke, he started to go out to lecture again. And he was going to make a trip to Brazil, and I was going there. There was a whole group of satsang, I guess you'd call it, that went, and that was amazing to be there a couple of weeks with him. Now, that was probably in 2002. And in 2004, he was going to India. It turned out to be his last trip to India. And I was asked if I wanted to join the group. And we met in Delhi and took a bus down to Kenchi, which is the major Maharaji ashram. So that was fantastic. And we spent 3 weeks at the ashram, and just being there, Ram Dass was there, and Siddhi Ma, who was running the ashram, she was an extremely special person. It was just an amazing 3 weeks. But towards the end of that stay, Ram Dass started to get sick. He had some kind of, it was, I don't know, it seemed like to me it was close to pneumonia. It was a really bad cold, really bad. And, so most people would, especially in his condition, would have imagined in a wheelchair and traveling from the San Francisco area all the way to India. He came back to touch base in in California, was there for overnight, and the next day went to Maui. Got to Maui and did a retreat. And by the end of the retreat, he was really fried. He had such a bad infection. It was sepsis and everything. So he ended up in the hospital, and he was there for several weeks. And, they weren't sure then if he was going to make it. Mm-hmm. But he decided at that point, yes, I am going to stay on Maui. It's where he had, for many years, decided he'd love to retire. And, of course, he never retired. He was still working up until he died. So, and in the meantime, so there he was. He's on Maui. He just got out of the hospital. He was in, this house. This person who was taking care of him, a dear friend of mine, was going back to India. So they needed someone to help out. And I left my job as a director of human resources, and it was my plan to travel for about a year and then make a decision whether I wanted to go back into the corporate world. So I was visiting in San Francisco, and I visited with some friends, and they said, "Hey, we're going to Maui next week, and we're going to be visiting with Ram Dass. So if you'd like, come with us." All right. So I went back home to New Jersey, packed my bags, and met them in Maui. And we had some lovely dinners with Ram Dass, and it was beautiful. And one night we had dinner at his house, and after dinner we were in the kitchen, and he wheeled his chair around the kitchen island, and he said to me, "So you want to be my nurse?" And of course I said yes. And I said I can do it for about 2 months, and that 2 months turned into 15 years of loving service.
Wow, what an incredible journey. I love all of these trips that you took following him around the world to hear him speak and participate in that. And it's like he not only brought that heart energy into your experience of life, but adventure, right? All of these places that you were going. So when you were going to see him talk, especially maybe the first few that you went to, were you able to interact with him? Were you, because if you do like a whole week-long thing, you really spend a lot of time together. Yeah.
For a long period of time, I was really intimidated by him. There was no reason to. He was the easiest man to talk to. But, I guess, I probably had him on a pedestal. And it was just difficult. I mean, I would go up and I would hug him, but I could hardly talk in front of him the first several years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way that he not only impacted your life, but so many, and he was one of the biggest voices that came back from the East in the 60s and 70s, bringing these concepts and these practices that are so infused into our culture today that were completely brand new at the time. And I just think it was this time of exodus, right?
Yes.
Where these brave seekers went looking for something because it didn't feel right the way we were doing it here, looking for those answers and coming back with gurus and lessons and yoga and meditation and things that I'm so grateful for that, because I feel like we benefit from all the work that they did and the way that Ram Dass especially was able to just articulate and reach us on a heart level. Yeah. My first meeting was with Ram Dass. Actually, the only time I saw him in person was when I went to see Wayne in Maui in 2007. Now, I think you said you were probably at that conference.
I was definitely at that conference.
At the Westin. Yes. So I came to see Wayne. I've been following Wayne forever, right? And I knew a little bit about Ram Dass, but not a lot. I didn't feel like I knew enough to take up his time, basically. But, they lifted him up in his wheelchair on the stage, and it's like...
Yeah.
And he speaks very slowly, but I was mesmerized. And like, he's telling these funny stories, of all of his experiences with psychedelics and going to India, and he's so charming, and it was really unexpected that I was drawn in. And after the talk, and he's off by the side, and there's just a few people standing around him, milling about in between during the break. And I sort of walked up, but I'm like, well, they probably know a lot about him, and I don't want to take up his time. Like, who am I,
Yeah.
And so I stopped about 10 feet away, and he made eye contact with me. And I still get choked up when I think about this, because it was just this energy that never left me. And when I learned more about it, I think it was actually the love from Maharaji. He was radiating that, you know, and when we locked eyes, it's like it just went in me and it never left me. But I just had this, from a cognitive point of view, I just had this sense that he totally understood why I was standing there, why I was keeping my distance, how I felt, and it was all okay. I didn't have to push. I didn't have to come forward. It was all okay. And like, we had that connection in just this moment that it was just, I've never experienced anything like it. And it wasn't until later that I learned more about his guru that I was like, that's exactly what this sounds like.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
And the connection between Wayne and Ram Dass. So Wayne Dyer really looked up to him as a mentor and a teacher. And there's a quote he wrote a letter in 2004 asking for support when Ram Dass decided he was going to stay on Maui, right after that last trip to India. He's going to stay, and Wayne was already living there. And he's like, yes, you should stay. But of course, Ram Dass hadn't taken any money for all the work that he'd been doing, so he didn't have all this money saved away like Wayne was doing, right? Yeah. Wayne was the businessman, right? And and he wrote this letter called Be Here For Him Now. And there's a quote here I'm going to read. It says, to me, Ram Dass was and is the finest speaker I have ever heard, period. He was my role model on stage, always gentle and kind, always speaking without notes from his heart, sharing his inspiring stories, and always with great humor. I tell you this from my own heart. I could listen to his lectures for hours and always felt saddened when they would end.
Nice. Beautiful.
So Ram Dass was the foundation for so much of the way Wayne showed up in the world.
Yeah. When you think of it, they really shared, particularly before Ram Dass's stroke. I mean, his humor prevailed throughout his whole life, even post-stroke. But, they both used humor. They both made fun of themselves. They were both able to interpret, complex spiritual concepts and make it easy for people to digest. And I've heard Wayne say that he had followed, and sometimes from afar, Ram Dass for 40 years, from the early 60s. And he would listen to his cassettes, and occasionally he would go and see him. It was really interesting. And that letter, and that was just about the time that I was getting there in 2005. It was, I think that the letter went out, I think it was in April. And what happened was, Ram Dass was never that concerned with money. His guru, Maharaji, told him not to handle money. And so when he was in India, he had someone he had a money holder, someone who actually carried his money. And he declined the inheritance from his father, and he was the a co-founder of this organization called the Seva Foundation, and he would do like 50 city tours to promote and to acquire money for the Seva Foundation, and just took enough so that he could do the traveling. Even his book, Be Here Now, the large majority of the proceeds went elsewhere and not to him. There was I don't know if you remember the Be Here Now book, but there was a little graph with where all of the different allocations for the book went. The Lama Foundation was a really big one. And so it was good. So when he got here, at that point, when he had the stroke, one of the things that was affected was his ability to understand figures and numbers. And so, he came with what he was coming for a week, and no concept. And the first person that was here went to pay the rent and looked into the checkbook, and there was like $11 for the month. So a good friend of ours, Chuck Blitz, met with Wayne, and Ram Dass was there too, and Wayne was explaining the situation. Excuse me, Chuck was explaining the situation, and Wayne said, "You know what I can do? I've got a base of 3 million people, followers on the internet, and I can write a letter, and maybe that might help." So he went home and wrote this letter, and it was totally inspired. He said he felt it was inspired by God or Maharaji. And so he had his letter the next morning, and it was a beautiful letter. You read some of his thoughts about Ram Dass. And, it was, the letter went out, and Ram Dass was he felt he was always the giver, so it was a complex for him to be the receiver, and he was brought up wealthy and never really had to think that much about money, and so it was a big deal for Ram Dass as well.
Yeah,
but it was a beautiful letter, and it brought in, I don't know, probably close to $300,000, and these beautiful letters came in, and we would handwrite responses to just about every one of them, and when Wayne would come over, we would read some of the special letters to him. He loved it.
Yeah. I know there's a 2-part YouTube video with a conversation between Ram Dass and Wayne shortly after this all happened. And
yes.
I remember Ram Dass sort of admitting in that conversation that he wasn't totally comfortable with being in that position of receiving. Yeah. And it's interesting his journey too, that, maybe it was the first half of his life or more was all giving. Yeah. And then he was put in a position to practice on the receiving end for all the years after his stroke. That was 97 to 2019. So
yeah,
more than 20 years, right?
More than 20 years. Yeah.
So you must have seen sort of a process with him in making that part of his practice to let all of that in, because everything was grist for the mill, right?
Yeah. It was when he had his stroke, he had to give up a lot of things. He had to give up driving a car and playing golf, and he had airplanes and airplane, and he had to give that up, and so there was a lot, and he had to learn how to be dependent and how to receive. He was always on the giving end, and he said, this is really difficult for me, But you know what? He did a really good job, and he really accepted that he needed help, and it was really something. That, and you know, back in I guess the 90s, he wrote this book, How Can I Help? And then all of a sudden he would say, now, how can you help me?
Yeah. And I love that he could laugh about it too.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what made him so relatable, is that he wasn't trying to act like he'd got it all figured out and he was fully enlightened and that was that. And he's sitting on the mountaintop. He said, you know, after meditating with real meditators and all this time, and, you know, I haven't lost one of my neuroses.
Yeah.
And I adore him for that, because he almost, he's like a model for us that, like, it's okay to be human and you can still be on this path and you can still be, you know, plugged into the work, I guess, the work of loving awareness.
Yes.
For me, I think it's amazing how long he lived. For one, he was about 10 years older than Wayne Dyer, I believe. And
he was born in 31, and I think Wayne was born in 1940. So
40,
9, 10 years,
And so you can see how that sort of mentor relationship began. There was also a difference in age and experience there.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Ram Dass outlived Wayne. He outlived Louise Hay, you know, and I always felt like, just from my little tiny glimpse into his life from way over here, was that after the stroke, a lot of people would have just given up. Like the struggles that he faced, and I'm sure he had moments, but I think a lot of people just would have lost their motivation to keep going. And I am just amazed to have witnessed the little pieces that showed that all the way through the rest of his days, he would take the pain, he would take the experience, he would take the paralysis and use it and use it. I mean, wow.
Yeah. It was truly amazing. And, you know, many people said that the last 15 years of his life is when he really grew into being Ram Dass. That was his time when he was here and he wasn't traveling. He was so content, and although he had lots of pain, he looked at it to a degree as grace, fierce grace, as his first documentary talks about. But he was just, it was just beautiful to watch him. He would sit, actually, in this study right here, he would sit and look out at the ocean and listen to the wind on the trees and the birds go by. And he was very, very happy. And to the very end, he continued teaching and being with people. He had weekly interviews or sessions with people. They were called heart to heart. So people could sign up on the website and get a free hour with Ram Dass. He would do 2 every week, and
I should have signed up for that.
And he loved it. He loved listening and interacting and giving advice to people. And let me see if you see. Well, right over here there is a chair right next to his chair, and people would come and just spend so much time with him. And it's really funny. Part of my job was to be a gatekeeper because he had limited energy, and so I would prep people before they'd come up and spend some time with him, and I'd say things like, well, he's not really doing all that well today, so it'd be wonderful if you could just spend an hour. Oh yeah, no problem, we'll do it. So they would come and they would speak with him, and they would get engaged, and maybe at the 2-hour mark, I'd come up And I'd say, how's everything in here? And Ram Dass would wave me off. He knew what I was doing. And so that promise to keep it to an hour. And if I were one of them, I would have done the same. But he always had someone that was coming to, whether it was a local person or whenever anybody came into town.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like he was like a magnet for community. It seemed like there always people gravitated to him. And I got to say, I didn't know what to expect going to Ram Dass's house. I was so excited just to be able to be in that space. And it's so beautiful there. But I think one of the things that I left with was the sense that he was surrounded by love because of people like you who were with him every day, and that I can see that he wasn't just cared for, he was loved. And that sort of puts me at ease of going, well, it must have been hard all those years with a stroke and health issues and getting older and all of that. But it makes me feel happier. It's like a sense of relief, like to witness that, oh, yes, of course, he had people loving him right to the end.
Well, he was very lovable, so.
Yeah, that's true.
It wasn't hard. It wasn't hard.
Can you tell us more about what your position was at the house? So you came, was it 2005? You came up and, what was it that you did, or what was a typical day like?
Oh, yeah. A typical day. Let's see. Well, we were in another location in Maui up until 2007. And then we moved to this location, and I would come up every morning, and I'd say at 8:00. He'd like to get up at 8, so I'd come up, and I'd say good morning. Oh, we had an intercom, so I would push the button and say good morning, Ram Dass, and you'd fumble around and. And one of the caregivers just last week sent me a audio of the intercom thing, and he would push the button after he found it, and he'd say, "Good morning, Dassi Ma." So I'd bring his medications upstairs, and we'd help him wash and. Took his vital signs and sometimes gave him injections, depending. He had multiple infections, and many times ended up in the hospital. Probably averaged at least once a year, sometimes a couple of times a year. So we would do that, and then one of the guy caregivers would help him in the bathroom, and Ram Dass would do his own shaving with his left hand, and he'd go downstairs. We had an elevator. It's a parallel elevator that would come from the top of the steps down to the bottom, and most of the time he would eat in the dining room area if he didn't eat outside. And, he'd love his favorite breakfast was plop plops, which were poached eggs on toast with marmalade and butter. That was his eggs Benedict, since he was watching what he ate. He went
nice.
To some of his doctors were very health conscious, and so that was his favorite breakfast. But he loved things like oatmeal and things of that nature. And then we generally had we'd go through the emails that had come in, and if we had to do some correspondence, and Depending on if he was meeting somebody, and he had lots of doctor's visits, and physical therapy, and so part of the day was dedicated to that, and sometimes he would take a rest. We'd try to get into the pool as often as possible. He loved the pool, although he was restricted by the stroke, but when he got in the water, he was free, and he loved it. Sometimes he would dance in the water. It was really beautiful. We have a pool that we built right outside, and it's a great pool. And he'd put a noodle around him, and he would actually be able to walk in the water. And it's interesting to go into another subject for a moment. Early on, when Wayne visited, Ram Dass was able to do a little tiny bit of walking, and he worked on that really hard with physical therapists. And Wayne says, "Okay, next time I see you, when I come back from my trip, I expect you to be, walking all over the place." So the next time Wayne came to visit, Ram Dass walked from the end of the corridor into the living area to meet Wayne. And I think we have a picture of that someplace. Yeah.
I would love to see that picture. Let me know if you find it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I guess that must have been in 2005, 2006. And then up until he was like really making good progress. And then in 2000, I think might have been 2009, a couple of things happened. He fell and broke his hip, and then his left arm that he used to help himself up got a couple of rotator cuff injuries, and they couldn't do anything about it. So that ability to help himself up was taken away from him, as well as the problems with the hip. So, he tried really hard to walk after that, and went to physical therapy on a regular basis. And sometimes they would say, "Okay, now we're going to stand. We're going to stand, and we're going to take some steps." But it wasn't to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so getting back to a typical day. He might have a meeting in the afternoon, and then after we'd go into the water, and then he'd take a little rest, and we'd have dinner usually around 6:30 in the evening, and then sometimes we'd watch television. We'd watch things like Stephen Colbert. We both love Stephen Colbert, or The Daily Show, and there was a series on the Hindu spiritual book, the Ramayana. And we watched that probably 7 times. It's like, I don't know, 20 DVDs. And it was made in the 80s. So we watched that a lot. Or sometimes we'd watch some series like West Side, West Wing, or 6 Feet Under. We watched Boston Legal.
That's fun.
And then, so that was great. And then we'd go to bed, and every night we'd have this routine at night where we'd come up and help him get ready for bed, and take his vitals again, and any injections or whatever was needed. And he had this group of doctors, so there was always something new that we were trying. And I'd say, "Good night, Ram Dass. I love you." And he would say, "I love you too." Oh. And we did that every night until his final day. That was the last thing he said to me was, "I love you."
What else is there, right?
Yeah.
That says it all. Wow. It's so interesting to think about Ram Dass watching TV too, I think, because like, we get these ideas in our heads of like, oh, he's this great speaker on the stage. And I love hearing about that more human side of the day to day. Now, did you guys have the pool put in at the house so it wasn't there when you?
We did. And it's it's a nice big pool. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Last week we had these horrendous windstorms, and we had this small house on the property, and this set of solar panels flew off and flew onto the solar panel for the pool, broke the solar panel, and then one of the fellas turned the pump off for the pool, but didn't turn it off right, and 3/4 of the pool drained.
Oh no!
So we're still working with that.
Oh, that was quite a windstorm.
Yeah.
Trade winds, right? You get the trade winds.
We get the trade winds. We sure do.
Now, you also would go down and bring him to swim in the ocean, right? Yes. I remember seeing pictures of that.
Yeah, that was a weekly tradition. Mm. We would go to the south side. We live on the north side in Haiku, and we would go to Kihei, to Cam 1, every morning and every Monday morning, and it started off with just 3 of us, and then more people would find out about it and join us, and sometimes there'd be 30, 40 people there. And Wayne joined us a couple times there as well. One time he was scheduled to join us and never made it. And a friend of his said, "Oh, Wayne, he's got a terrible sense of direction. He's always getting lost."
I understand he wasn't very good with time either. He wasn't good at watching the clock. So.
But so we would swim in the ocean, and we had this little ritual afterwards. We would do he would do "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy," because we'd swim out to a buoy, and so buoy boy, mm-hmm. And then he'd say "Oh joy, oh joy, oh joy, oh joy," and we named this the Bobbing with Baba. And and then we had this gal who has declared herself to be the Minister of Fun. So we had to do the Minister of Fun routine, and then we had another fellow who studied Hawaiian chants, and we'd do a Hawaiian chant, and maybe we'd do a little bit of row, row, row your boat. One of Ram Dass. So we always used row, row, row your boat before he had to speak, just to make sure that his throat was opened up.
Yeah. Now, were you doing weekly?
And then we go to lunch.
Well, yeah, you get hungry being out in the ocean, of course. Yeah. Now, did you guys do weekly kirtan back then too? Were you having the?
We did regular kirtans. We didn't do them weekly. Yeah. So it would probably be every other week, depending what was going on. We'd send out an email and people would come.
That's great. Now, I understand that his spiritual interests and his practices were a bit eclectic. I know his book collection certainly is. Did he have something that he did on a regular basis, or what was his practice like?
His practice, yeah. Towards the end, we would meditate. Sometimes, most times we'd meditate before dinner. And he looked at the time he spent in his chair as a meditation. Yeah. So you'd look at the clouds and how the clouds would come and how they would split. And he really used that as a spiritual practice. So towards the end, he always said, you use a method and then you slay it. But his life, other than maybe watching TV, it was a spiritual practice.
Yeah, I can see that. If anybody hasn't seen the Netflix video Ram Dass Going Home that was taped on the property there, it's just so beautiful. And I had seen it years ago when it came out. I think that was 2018. Yeah. And then when we were flying home from Maui, I actually watched it on the plane. And it was so different to see it after having just been in that space. And I love that you've preserved his study, and you can see it in the video too, that like so much of the house you've kept the same as when he was there, and the energy is so strong. Yeah. Did you plan on keeping the house after he passed? No, not at all. It was straight, interesting unfolding. His foundation, which is Love, Serve, Remember, and they're located in California, and they contemplated at one point about keeping the house, and Ram Dass thought, well, that might be nice just to have a place for people to touch base, but financially it wasn't really feasible for them to do it. So when Ram Dass died, a lot of the caregivers over the years, some would come for 6 months, some would come for a year, some would come for 3 years. They all gathered back together, and they would meet at night, and they'd say, hey, man, we can't let this place go. This is so, it's just, his spirit is so deeply embedded. We just can't let it go. So after 3 nights or so, they called for a meeting, and we had about 25 people in the meeting. And my thought was, okay, once we settle up here, I'll probably get a small cottage on Maui and, live out the rest of my life there. But they had this meeting, and I don't know if you can see that portrait of Ram Dass behind me? Yeah. That was in the living room, and I was sitting there, and I was looking at Ram Dass during this meeting, and the caregivers were so impassioned about keeping the house and how important it was for people to come by, and other spiritual teachers had a place where you could go and just feel their presence. So they were so deeply committed to having this happen. And then there was someone in the meeting who was saying, well, then you have to form a 501c3, and it's very difficult to have a nonprofit, and then you have to have a board, and there's always disagreements, and like the energy in the room was going down and down and down. And I looked up at that portrait of Ram Dass, and you can't see it, but his eyes are so vibrant in that portrait. And I looked, and it's almost like he's smirking. And I looked in that portrait, and it was like, yes, you could do it. And so I turned around to the group, and I said, okay, let's do it. And that's how we formed Hanuman Maui. I love it.
Our mission is to continue his legacy here on Maui.
Mm-hmm. So are you open to the public, and what's next for Hanuman Maui? What's the plan?
Well, we're open to the public, but on a limited basis, because we have a homeowners association, and we want to be in good stead with them. One of the things we're starting to look at is Ram Dass never owned this house. That's another story, which if we have time, I'll tell you. But we paid the mortgage, and the owner of the place, Dr. Raj, who lives in Florida, the last thing Ram Dass asked him was to make sure that I was taken care of.
Oh.
Yeah. And so he agreed to rent us the house, the same deal that that Ramdas had. And so we're paying the mortgage. So right now today, as a matter of fact, we had our first meeting to look at the feasibility of buying the house.
Mm.
What was the question? I got lost in that.
What's next for Hanuman Maui?
What's next for Hanuman? Oh, yeah, and we've done several things already since the 20. As a matter of fact, our third anniversary is coming up. I think it's next week. And the first thing we did was we made the Loving Awareness Garden, the Ramdas Loving Awareness Garden. And we, as you remember, we made a labyrinth, and it, of course, had to be a heart-shaped labyrinth. And we buried some of his ashes in that garden, and then had a ceremony and put a mango tree on top of the ashes, which is now starting to grow very nicely. And the next project we had was building a temple, and we. So that was, extraordinary that we were able to do that in so short a time. And we do prayers, arti, in there twice a day. And this afternoon, as a matter of fact, we're going to do 11 Hanuman Chalisas, because it's the first Tuesday of the month, and that's when we do it. And then the third thing, the big project we had was to create an additional retreat cottage, and it's beautiful. It turned out really beautiful. It's right on the ocean, and people come typically for like a 5-day retreat, and sometimes more, sometimes a little less. And
is that on the same property?
It's on the same property, yeah. Yeah. So many times during the month we have personal retreatants, which is lovely.
Yeah.
And, so our major thing right now is determining whether we can purchase the house. And we have, a lot of people that are helping us. We have Paul Selleck, who I believe you know. He's a great guy, and next week he's going to do a benefit for Hanuman Maui. This is the third year he's done that. Yeah,
that's great.
And that's great. And then on Ramdas's birthday, which is April 6th, Jack Cornfield and Trudy Goodman are going to do a Zoom podcast, or not a Zoom for the benefit of Hanuman Maui. So that's
great.
Really looking forward to that. Yeah, and we people can come. We do have, meditations on Thursday, and we do have chanting on Sunday. But as I mentioned, we are part of a homeowners association, so we have to be a little careful. We don't want to upset any of the neighbors.
Yeah, it is a private property. It's not a...
Yeah, this is the only place we can do, this is where, people who come here really feel Ramdas's presence. So there's no other, if this doesn't work, there's no other place we would consider doing it.
Well, it feels right, and I believe that what's meant to be will be. So yes. I am certain you have forces on both sides conspiring for your benefit. So I love that yes. Ramdas went out of his way to make sure that you were going to be taken care of. You were more than family to him, more than family. Yeah. So for all of our listeners, if they want to offer support, what's the best way that we can support Hanuman Maui?
Our email address is info@hanumanmaui.org. And we also have a website, Hanuman Maui. And they can go on there, and if they felt so inclined, they could make a donation.
All right. HanumanMaui.org. You can make a donation. You've got a little shop there. I know you guys do some other events and things once in a while, benefits. So yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about when I was getting ready to talk to you today is how, for decades, Ram Dass was known for talking about death and dying and end of life care. It was something he participated in. I think he was very courageous in the way that he opened the conversation, because particularly in our culture, right, we keep it behind closed doors. So
yes.
I was wondering, now that he passed in December of 2019, from your perspective, what kind of impact did all of those years of work have on his own experience of dying?
It really had an excellent impact. Well, I think Ram Dass was ready to, he was accepting of death 20, probably even before he had the stroke. And he was very interested in death and dying, and did those workshops, and he even started a dying center in the 80s in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where people would come to die a spiritual death, and there would be caregivers and doctors who were interested in the spiritual path too. And one of the things he would say was that that the environment was so good that no one wanted to die, that they lived on. And that organization is still alive and well in California now. It's not a place. It's not a physical place, but it's an organization. And the name of it is blank. I'm blanking on that right at the second. But anyway, Ram Dass did workshops and he talked about death, and he has a whole big section in his library on death and dying, on near-death experiences, on what happens after death, and he was really fascinated with that. He wrote that book, a great book with Mirabai Bush on walking each other home. And that's one of those books where you can open it up and just read a page or two, and it's like, oh, that's helpful. It was really good. And he in terms of his death, he wanted to have a very conscious death. He didn't want. He wanted to be, conscious. He wanted to be conscious when he died. He was hoping that he didn't have to have a lot of morphine or, medication that would fog his brain. Or certainly, some people think of Ram Dass as, one of the kings of psychedelics, but he didn't want that. He didn't want that when he died. He was so excited for the process, for the journey, that he wanted to fully embrace it and to travel clear. And so one of the things that happened there was he knew that I was attached to him, and so he said, I really want to have a clear death. So I don't want anyone holding me back. I just want, I don't want pictures of family or, maybe a picture of Maharaji, but that's it. And I just want people to be there and it to be a clear field so I can exit. And so that was a major challenge for me. There were about 5 of us at his bedside that last day, and he, it was just to be there and not to have any emotion whatsoever. And I was pretty proud that I was able to accomplish that. And his death was, his death was it was quiet. It was peaceful. And he took, at the end, he took 3 deep breaths and he was gone.
What did that feel like? What was the energy in the room with that? Well, first of all, your practice of surrender.
Yeah.
And what a release. Could you feel that when he left?
It wasn't like he's gone. It was,
right.
Yeah, he was still there. As a matter of fact, I said to one of the doctors that was there, I'm not sure he's still breathing. So they got out a stethoscope and checked to see if there was any pulse, and there wasn't. But it was the air. You could feel the air in the room. You could just feel it. And it wasn't, it wasn't a day that we got up and said, okay, this is going to be his last day. But he was not in great shape. He was able to do a 2 weeks prior to his death, he did his last retreat. And that whole year of 2019 was a really tough year for him. It was a roller coaster with his health. He'd get a major infection and he'd end up in the hospital. And at one point we said to him, Ram Dass, do you want to go on? And he said, he stopped, thought about it and said, I still have people I need to tell about Maharaji. Yeah. And so up until 2 weeks before he died, he was still teaching. We thought he'd go to this retreat and just be there, and we talked about that, and he'd say, yeah. He went there and he taught as hard as he could. As a matter of fact, there was at the end of every retreat, we'd have a what we call a mala ceremony. So we would give out malas, and we would put little threads of Maharaji blanket on the mala, and everyone would go up to Ram Dass and get a mala, and then be introduced to Maharaji. And so this last retreat, we said, okay, Ram Dass, why don't you just bless the malas, and then you leave, and we'll give out the malas. And initially he said yes, and when we got there, he said, no, I'm giving out the mala. So to 400 people,
wow,
he gave the mala.
And he loved it, right? He loved having that really interaction, looking people in the eye, and
looking into their soul, not just their eyes, really looking deeply into each soul.
Wow, he was really something special, and he still is.
Yeah.
And boy, whew, what a journey! What an incarnation, huh?
Yeah,
what a life!
Sure.
And I think it's wonderful that he had an opportunity to sort of, make that exit on his own terms and in his own space.
Yes. And
so many people don't. And I think that's part of the work he was doing, is to open our eyes to death is not a failure. And this is the next great adventure. And that the way that we can just sit with a person through whatever their experience of that is I feel like I haven't learned that anywhere else. I'm sure there's other people talking about it, but his life is his message, and that's the one that reached me. So I'm grateful for that.
Wow.
Now, before I let you go, one more question. Do you have, or what is one of your favorite memories with Ram Dass? Because you must have so many. What's one of your favorite memories? What brings you joy to think about?
Oh, there's so many. What comes to my mind is at one point I was going to take 3 or 4 days off and go over to another island here. And I had told Ram Dass I was going, and then right before I left, I went up to him and I said, Ramdas, I'm leaving. And he said, oh, no. And he started to cry. He said, I thought we would be together until we died. Yeah, we'd love to go on as a group. We would go on adventures wherever, whether it was going down to into Tahana, or into the woods up in the mountains, or just to the beach, or we loved doing that. Occasionally we'd take a trip over to Lanai and stay there for 2 or 3 days, and he would love it. He would sit there in his chair and go in the pool and the hot tub and look at the ocean, and it was great.
And I bet that when you go on adventures now, you still feel him with you, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like they experience it through us and with us,
yes.
Without the body, without the limitations of the body. So,
yes.
So maybe that's a beautiful thing.
I think so.
I know that you've seen my paintings here of Wayne Dyer and Ram Dass, and I've been working on a new one. It's not quite finished, but I wanted to give you a peek of Wayne and Ram Dass in Hawaii. And it's based off of, and I'd be happy to send you this when it's finished. But this is based off of
That's beautiful.
Thank you. This is the photo that I brought with me on our trip to Hawaii. Okay, so we rented the house from Carl, but we didn't know that he had any connection to Ram Dass and, any of that. The first day we get there, I set up my sacred space. I brought this framed photo and like a candle and a mala, and I set up my sacred space and I do a little meditation. And that night I was going, wait, I think Ram Dass's house was near here, because normally when we go, we stay on the west side of the island, not the north side. And I tell my husband in the morning, he's like, oh, you should ask Carl, because I think he said he was like an old hippie or something. Oh, yeah. I'm like, yeah, he probably at least knows who Ram Dass is. But I feel like all of this happened with me meditating with my Wayne Dyer Ram Dass photo, the one picture I brought with me to Hawaii.
Again.
Oh.
There it is. Yes, I took that photo.
And you took it!
And that's at Wayne's condo in Kanapali.
Thank you for telling me that. And thank you for taking the picture. I love this photo, right? And so now the painting I'm making is based off of that photo, but I always wanted to see them side by side, right? Because Wayne's like leaning over, and I'm like, I always wanted to see them
Fabulous
side by side. But it's just so funny how it all came together. So when I talked to Carl and I was like, oh, do you know Ram Dass? He's like, yeah, I know Ram Dass. I was friends with Ram Dass. Oh, you were? Oh, yeah, I knew him for 50 years. You knew him for 50 years? Yeah, we went to India. I almost fell over. It's just like the way that everything, there were so many synchronicities. I won't take up our time today on it, but the way that everything came together, and like getting to meet you and getting to come to the house, and like the bringing my kids back to Hawaii. We hadn't been there since our wedding.
Oh.
And it was just such a magical trip, and it was a highlight getting to come there. So thank you for everything that you've done for Ram Dass. Thank you for your own spiritual path. Maybe you were behind him, but you are certainly reaching so many people and maintaining the sanctuary. Whenever I see pictures and videos of Ram Dass, I almost always see you by his side, and knowing you, that really warms my heart, and seeing just that, he had that love.
And thank you for all that you're doing for Wayne as well.
Well, he had a big impact on my life, and he led me to a lot of other great teachers, but these two are the ones that really have impacted me the most and just embedded themselves in my heart and my soul in a way that I don't even understand, but it drives me today. So thank you for spending this time with me today. And I can't wait till I get to come back to the beautiful island of Maui, and spend more time and get to see the sanctuary again.
Well, I can't wait for you to come back.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. That's always been my backup plan, is move to Maui. So you never know. One day the timing might be right. But
Yeah, it was Wayne and Ramdas's vision to do that, and they did it.
I can see why. There's just something special. You can feel it. You can feel it in the land, and it's a beautiful place to live. So thank you for coming on today. For all our listeners, thank you for following Change Your Thoughts, Change Your Life, and telling your friends about it. The full video for this episode is available now exclusively on Patreon. You can get that link and more details about this podcast at nadiadelacruz.com. And until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Namaste.